Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, entendido. So, well, first of all, thank you to everybody to be here. As Carla was saying, I'm basically now trying to present my my research that I did during my PhD, but also that I'm carrying on doing during my postdoc, that is about the study of the agricultural development in drylands. And I wanted to start with a sort of provocation, asking you a question. So if you say, like, if we say the word drylands, what comes to your mind? Barcelona. Well, fair enough. Fair enough. Because if you think about, and if you think about the title of this presentation, it's not so common, it's not very common to associate the term agriculture with the term of drylands or desert. So I asked this very same question to the artificial intelligence. And this is basically the outputs I receive. So we have this image generated by the artificial intelligence where there's just like, basically you can see just cracked and very dry soil, and there's nothing else, anything else. And then there is the definition of ChatGPT that says basically that drylands are characterized by the scarcity of water, which is actually true. But it says also that drylands pose unique challenges for ecosystem and also human habitation. So even though ChatGPT's definition is not entirely incorrect, I would say that what unites this image and this definition, and in particular this image, is basically the scarcity of everything. In this picture, there's no water, but also there's no life, there's no humans, there's no plants, and no animals of any kind. And I really hope that by the end of this talk, you will go home with a completely different idea of drylands, if you don't already have it, maybe different from Barcelona also. So let's start with a sort of definition. So what's drylands? The official definition of drylands is based on a ratio that relates the annual precipitation and the evapotranspiration. So we know that in arid areas, it rains very little, and that the soil's evaporation is pretty high and rapid because of the light intensity. So drylands are this area characterized by a very low aridity index. But based on this numerical definition, it's quite surprising to see how drylands cover over the 30% of the Earth's land surface. And if we look at Africa, it covers over the 60% of the Africa's territories. But again, thinking about the first image I showed in the slide before, the strange thing is that we don't imagine almost half of the planet as desert, isn't it right? So, and indeed, it is not. Not yet. Yeah, it's true. Not yet. Not yet. And it's not even true that the desert, the real desert, so the lands that we truly consider unthinkable for agriculture and for plant growth, are actually impossible to cultivate. And this is, for example, well, and this is an example. This picture were taken by Carla Lancelotti and Stefano Biaggetti in Sudan. And this picture represents a field of C4 cereals, of C4 millets, basically of pear millet, that grow entirely under rain-fed conditions. What does this mean? That these plants have not been irrigated in any way, and they survived with less than 150 millimeters of annual rainfall that characterize these territories. And just to provide with a comparison, for example, in the region around Cadiz, so in the south of Spain, the annual rainfall, the average annual rainfall between the 90s and today, well, till 2019, is around 500 millimeters of water. So it's almost 5 times more than what these crops received. However, in drylands, not only cereals and agriculture, but more in general, plant species and animal species are diverse because these lands are characterized by a very high biodiversity. What does this mean? I wanted to provide you a couple of examples of publication like this one by Fernando Maestre, published and colleagues, published in Science in 2012. And Fernando came a couple of months ago to give a talk with us. But I also decided to put this image that is from a report published in 2014 by United Nations. And in these two publications, it is stated and demonstrated that drylands exhibit very high biodiversity, which is also positively correlated with multifunctionality. So in essence, to make it simple, this means that drylands, in drylands, there is abundance of everything. There's numerous plant species, animal species, and I would also personally would like to add also human resilience practices, and that this high biodiversity that exceeds the expectation compares to other ecosystem also maintain this ecosystem very functional. So in these ecosystems happen many things. One thing that I mentioned, I have just mentioned, but I want to emphasize again, is that not only the biodiversity of plants and animals is very high in drylands, but also the human strategies developed for adaptation. Again, I wanted to give you some examples. These pictures, again, were taken by Carla and Stefano in Sudan. The first one was taken in 2016 and the second one in 2019. And they were taken in the same spot. And basically in both pictures, you can see fields. Fields in the middle of the desert. In the first picture, I don't know, like here, you can see the sort of plots of the fields, because in this case, the fields were not irrigated, were grown rain-fed, so you cannot see the plants, but these are the plots. And in the second picture, you basically can see the plants, but because in this case, they started to intensively irrigate the crops, even in the middle of the desert. But this is not the only point. The point is that all around and above these fields, you can always find a series of archaeological artifacts indicated even if indirectly, that these agricultural areas have been occupied for millennia. For example, you can find grinding stones that were used to grind cereals, but also many pieces of pottery that somehow indicated the occupation of these spaces. So what I wanted to say with this slide is that not only drylands are characterized by a great adaptive capacity and a wide varieties of strategies to cultivate, but in all likelihood, these strategies have a millennia-long history, and we should start to look at, because as we always say, history has always something to teach. So I would say that recently, but well, in the last 10, 20 years, there has been a rise in research looking into the past of drylands as a rich environment. For example, I wanted to put this recent publication authored by Carla and Stefano, well, that attempts to document the extension of these agricultural practices, both in the past and in the present in North Africa. And with my research, I intend somehow to contribute in increasing the knowledge about these agricultural practices in drylands. And how? Well, try to provide an innovative methodology to detect proxy for water availability for agriculture in drylands. So basically trying to answer these two main questions. So I put this summary scheme of how we decided to answer this question that I borrow completely from Carla ERC project. So first of all, we wanted to understand how to detect water. Well, first of all, because we thought that it was the most efficient parameter to describe the level of field management in drylands, because we know that in drylands there's different ways to cultivate, but most of these strategies differ for the water levels provided to the crops. But also because studying water levels in crops well adapted to drought allows us to closely study how these plants are adapted to drought. Proposing a study which is highly interdisciplinary because focuses both on the archaeological study of the development of these agricultural practices, but also on the resilient ability of some crops to survive to water stress. And I want to emphasize that this is really important. For example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2022 and 2023 has identified drought as one of the most important causes of yield loss. So it proposed that studying how plants react to water limited resources has been is one of the most important issues regarding climate change. But how we want to do this? How we want to detect these water levels? Well, we decided to focus basically on the plant effect, so on the plant remains. Well, why? Basically, in archaeology, if we are very, very, very lucky, we can find traces of well, of tanks used for water storage, but all these type of remains only provide us with an indirect indication of the agricultural management, and do not tell us how much water the plant received to grow, or whether this water comes from the rains or from the groundwater or from a well. So we decided to focus on plant remains because we hypothesized that these plant remains could give us direct indication of the water management. And if you are not an archaeologist, well, the answer again is yes, we can find plant remains even in very ancient layers. And there's many options that belong, let's say, to the field of the archaeobotany. But among the many options, we decided to focus our attention on phytoliths, which are these things here, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more later, but also on seeds and grains, and also on their isotopical composition. And this because in literature, we know that this kind of proxy can be indicative of water availability. But there is a problem. These type of proxies are really well studied for cereals and even for other plant species that are typical and adapted to humid environments. But we do not know much about phytoliths or isotopical fractionation on crops well adapted to drought. So we don't know much about these species that we are interested on. And well, since we know little about the functioning of these plant remains in crops, in these crops we were interested on looking at, we decided to get completely analytical and first tested the production of these specific plant remains in modern crops. And this model, we actively decided to subject these modern crops to different water regimes to simulate all the many options of field conditions. So we try to simulate the rain-fed conditions and the irrigated conditions in drylands. And then thanks to this plant remain that we extracted from these experimental plants, so we look at the phytoliths and seeds and the grains, and we wanted to construct models for comparison with the archaeological one. Because of this, I conducted numerous experimental cultivations in different areas of the world with different crops. So I did 2 experimental cultivations in ICRISAT Research Center, so in central India, but I also conducted this experiment here in Barcelona, thanks to the funding provided to me by the Center for Study on Planetary Wellbeing. So basically, we built here at the UPF from zero an experimental station on the rooftop of the Mercè Rodoreda building. And essentially, this experimental station consists of a series of lysimeters and also a series of planters. So there's different type of planters filled with various type of soils, including one that we fill with sandy soil to simulate the desert conditions with high drainage and high evaporation rates. But we, as I was saying, we also have a lot of cylinders of lysimeters, which are a little bit more complex than a simple cylinder, but I won't give you all the details. But what I wanted to say that these specific tubes allowed us to do 2 very important things. First of all, to measure the transpiration rate of the crops. And this is crucial, is a crucial parameter because it indicates the actual amount of water that the plant uses to grow, which is very important when you are studying the water levels. And secondly, these cylinders allowed us to keep under control many parameters, among many even the water given to the plants. So they act like a sort of pots, but unlike the pots, because of their size, they leave space for the root exploration, so to the growth of the plants properly. And so they are really better than a pot. So now let's talk a little bit about the species we decided to cultivate to study, let's say, the past dry agriculture. So these drylands, in drylands, the crops cultivated both in the present and in the past usually fall under the general category of millets, which mostly belong to the branch of the monocotyledon, but they all have one particular characteristic in common, that they all are C4 crops. So C4 crops, C4 species are a special group of plants that are unified by a specific photosynthetic pathway. Without going into the details of this pathway, these plants basically allowed for a significant water saving during the growth because they can keep their stomata closed for extended periods, avoiding high transpiration rates. But despite this advantage, I have to say that C4 are pretty complex, as you can see, and these are just 2 examples of how C4 crops can be. So they basically have a specific morphology and a specific physiology, and most important things, most of this pathway remains unexplored. So we decided, we decided to cultivate these three different type of C4 crops, even because we were interested to look at this pathway that remains kind of unexplored. And we decided to go with the most commonly cultivated species. So we cultivate finger millet, sorghum, and pear millet. And then we also decided to add a C3 species as a sort of comparison or control. So we also cultivate 2 types of wheat in all our experiments. Most important, for each of these species, we decided to cultivate more than 10 different varieties. And we chose these varieties very carefully, and we decided to go just with land races. So, which means that they are all traditional, not implemented, not crop breeded varieties that we thought they would resemble as much as possible to the one that we we find in the past. So again, I want to come back to the topic of the interdisciplinary studies, because as I was mentioning earlier, the proxies, one of the proxies that we decided to test are phytoliths. Phytoliths are solid bodies of amorphous biosilica, so they are basically made of oxygen and silicon, and they are produced by the living plants. Phytoliths, as I was saying, they are inorganic because they are made of silicon and oxygen. So they preserve really very well in taxonomy. And so this is the reason why we can find them in the archaeological records, because they help us to distinguish the plant genera and sometimes even the families due to their various shapes that we call morphotypes. But the thing is, even if we know that plants and crops and even C4 crops produce phytoliths, we still don't know why these plants produce phytoliths and under what conditions. So what's make our research interesting from my point of view and also extremely interdisciplinary is that many recent studies are trying to demonstrate, and also they are proposing, that phytoliths may help these crops to respond to drought. So even if we are looking for ancient phytoliths, we really hope that our study will have a significant application even in modern agriculture and agronomy studies. So let's go straight to the results. So as I was saying, we were doing very interdisciplinary experiments and research. So we have very good results both in the field of physiology and in the field of archaeology. So I will start with the results that we had from the plant physiological analysis. Again, I will start with a definition. One of the most common index used to assess the plant efficiency is the transpiration efficiency index, which is a pretty straightforward index because it calculates the ratio between the biomass produced by the plants, so the plant itself, and the water transpired by the plants to grow, so basically the input. The surprising fact that we realized thanks to our study is that the land races we cultivate has a very, very high TE index, which is even higher in water stress conditions. So when we subjected these crops to, like, say, rain-fed regimes, that in well-water, like irrigated conditions. This means that these varieties, these ancient varieties, not subjected to any crossbreeding or implementation processes, are very, very efficient. And this means also that the deeply rooted belief that we have that millets are less efficient compared to wheat and maize is actually wrong. Because as you can see, these crops can produce a higher efficiency in water stress condition, and we want, like, maize is not able to be so efficient in water stress condition, which is already a thing. And I also wanted to say that sometimes even traditional and not implemented varieties can surprise actually for their high productivity. Another method that we usually use to evaluate the efficiency of a crop is by assessing their grain production, which is pretty logical if you think about. So more grains equate to more food and also to a higher fitness for the plant. So here I'm presenting the results of a multivariate analysis that where we plot all the physiological data we have from the plants, including even the biosilica data, the data about phytoliths. And we wanted basically to observe the interactions between the many variables. And I specifically decided to present this biplot because, or at least to me, it's pretty clear that illustrates that crops that produce more panicles, so more grains, are also the crops that accumulate more biosilica. So going more into the topic of biosilica and phytoliths, we also observe that not only the more general production of biosilica, but the production of some specific morphotypes, so of some specific phytoliths, is predictive of the water treatments. And the production of these specific morphotypes tend to increase in concentration under drought conditions. So although I know that these results seem highly specific, I would say that they carry significant implications for two reasons. First, because they suggested that likely biosilica is a trait that contributes to the drought response. And in other words, just to give you like a sort of simple example, this means that maybe we can start to think about green and very cheap solutions using silicon fertilizer, for example, in these places, in drylands, to improve the crop production. So this is, for example, is one very simple implication of study like this one. And silicon is very green, it's very cheap, and it doesn't pollute the soil, which is already basically composed by almost silicon. But the second thing that is really important because of this prediction is the fact that basically we were doing what I was saying at the beginning. So we demonstrate that phytoliths are predictive of the water levels. So this means that we can use them in the archaeological records to predict the water management of the past. And indeed, we did it. And we applied this model in various archaeological contexts. For example, here we have an example of the application of the model to 4 different sites in the Indus Valley region. These sites were all dated, well, the layers that we studied were all dated around the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. And the results seems to point out that most possibly, basically the people that inhabited these drylands in the past practices rain-fed agriculture with C4 crops grown in limited water conditions. Again, here a second example of the application of the model to archaeology. These studies was conducted again by colleagues, by Abel and colleagues of the raindrops. And in this case, the research was carried out in Ethiopia with the aim of reconstructing the cultivation practices during the Aksumite Kingdom. In this case, the methodology was a little bit more complex because it involved also the construction of a model based on ethnographic and environmental data. And I included here the model workflow that it was used to construct the model. But the interesting thing is that the model that I mentioned earlier about phytoliths was used to validate this one. And both models seem to indicate that the same type of cultivation in the past, which is extensive rain-fed. So again, this implies that in these lands, the rain-fed cultivation is not just an entirely new practice, but is something that it was done even in the past. So to summarize and conclude, I would say that this study have gathered a series of very valuable insights that I believe that they are actually highly relevant even today, especially in face of the phenomena such as drought, yield loss, and desertification. First of all, I want to underline how millets and many of the C4 cereals can thrive even in water scarcity conditions and allowed for harvest even when irrigation is not even thinkable. And I want to add like a sort again of provocation. So why we don't use them more in agriculture even right now? Again, I wanted to say that apart from using millets, we should also look back at these varieties that are almost forgot. But this variety, apart from being really valuable, they are also like part of this huge biodiversity that we need to maintain to preserve this ecosystem, again, very functional. And well, most important, I would say that we need to take into consideration that rain-fed agriculture is feasible even in drylands, and it has historically been practiced by society that has thrived and flourished because it represents a sustainable solution. So we should start rethink about this agricultural practice. So I wanted to do like a sort of like a quick advertising. So we have still a lot of samples and still a lot of data sets. So if everybody is interested in the topic and want to contact us, we will be more than happy. I wanted to talk also about open data availability and the fact that all the environmental and physiological data, even about the experiments on the rooftop of the UPF, are available open access, but I don't want to be too long. I also wanted to thank deeply from my heart all the people from CASES that helped me during the experimental cultivations on the rooftop. I know that it was like kind of tough, so thank you. And so thank you. And that's it.